It started with a faint buzzing, like an angry mosquito that wouldn't quit, cutting through the quiet of my afternoon as I knelt beside my tomato plants, wiping sweat from my brow with a dirt-streaked hand. I looked up, squinting against the sun, and there it was, a sleek black drone hovering over my field, its camera lens tilting downward like a nosy neighbor peering over a fence. Instinctively, I reached for my shotgun leaning against the barn, but then another buzz joined the first, then another, and within seconds, 4 more drones circled above like vultures eyeing a fresh kill. At first, I figured it was punk kids messing around or someone's fancy gadget gone rogue, but then I caught the stickers plastered on their sides. HOA? Stomach dropped, because only one person was unhinged enough to pull this off. Karen, the HOA president from hell, a tyrant in yoga pants who'd made it her mission to control everything and everyone, even beyond her jurisdiction. She wasn't just a busybody. She was a walking surveillance system with a permanent scowl, a voice that could peel paint, and an unshakable belief that the world bowed to her rules. Unfortunately for her, my farm sat just outside her precious HOA's grasp, a fact that never stopped her from trying to meddle. A week earlier, she'd slipped a note into my mailbox, her passive-aggressive cursive whining. "Dear resident, the state of your property is concerning. HOA regulations must be upheld for community beautification. Please ensure your farm meets aesthetic standards." And I'd crumpled it up, tossing it aside, figuring she'd get bored since she had no legal pull here. Boy, had I underestimated her level of crazy. Now standing in my field with those drones buzzing overhead, I put my hands on my hips and glared, muttering, "You've got to be kidding me," as one tilted slightly, almost mocking me. I grabbed a rock and chucked it, but the drone dodged effortlessly, the others hovering like menacing hummingbirds, their cameras zooming in, and my blood boiled. This wasn't just annoying, it was a flat-out invasion of privacy. Determined to get answers, I stomped off toward the HOA office, a shiny little building that screamed unnecessary rules and overpaid busybodies. But before I could even step inside, Karen strutted out onto the porch, arms crossed, her smug grin infuriating enough to make me grind my teeth. "Ah, Jake," she cooed, her voice dripping with fake concern. "I was hoping you'd stop by. Have you seen our new HOA security drones? Impressive, aren't they?" I scoffed. Security. "Karen, those things are spying on my farm. I don't even live in your HOA. She waved a manicured hand dismissively. "Your property borders our community, and as president, I have a duty to ensure everyone follows aesthetic guidelines. We wouldn't want property values to drop, would we?" I shot back, "Lady, I grow crops. Unless you've got a problem with tomatoes, this doesn't concern you." But she sighed dramatically, like I was the unreasonable one. "It's not just the crops, Jake, it's the vibe of your farm, the equipment, that fencing, oh dear, those old tires by the barn. Simply unacceptable." I stared at her, trying to figure out if she was serious or just certifiable, and said, "So let me get this straight. You think some tires on my land are an eyesore, so you're sending drones to harass me?" She smiled, all innocence. "It's not harassment, it's compliance monitoring." And I clenched my jaw. "Turn them off." Her sweet little smirk didn't budge. "I'm afraid I can't. HOA policy." And I took a deep breath, forcing myself not to yell. "Let me explain something, Karen. You don't own my land, you don't control what I do, and if those drones keep coming, they're gonna start dropping out of the sky real fast." Her eyes narrowed. "Are you threatening HOA property?" I grinned. "Nope, just warning you." And she huffed, spun on her heel, and marched back inside, slamming the door so hard the frame rattled. I stood there, fists clenched, knowing this wasn't over, not by a long shot. By the time I got home, the drones were still there, closer now, hovering just above my crops, and I smirked, grabbing my phone for a quick search. Karen wanted a fight, and I was about to give her one she wouldn't forget. The drones buzzed over my field like a persistent swarm, their sleek black bodies glinting in the late afternoon sun, and I knew Karen wasn't going to let up. She'd taken her HOA obsession to a new level, and I wasn't about to let her spy on my farm without a fight. I headed to my neighbor Earl's place the next morning, a retired Air Force engineer with a workshop full of gadgets that probably skirted the edge of legality. When I told him about Karen's drones, he let out a deep chuckle. "She's using consumer-grade surveillance toys, huh? Nothing fancy, you could take him down with a rock if you're lucky." I admitted, "Tried that, didn't work." and he scratched his chin, grinning. Ever hear of a signal jammer? An hour later, I was back on my farm, setting up a small black box Earl had lent me. It'd scramble the drone's signals within a certain radius, he'd said, causing them to lose control, and I flicked it on, crossing my arms to watch the show. The first drone wobbled, sputtered, then spiraled down, crashing into the dirt with a pathetic plop. I laughed as the second went down moments later, followed by the third and fourth, like mechanical flies swatted from the sky. By the time the fifth hit the ground, I was wiping tears from my eyes, the satisfaction almost as sweet as the tomatoes I grew. Predictably, Karen showed up the next morning, storming onto my land red-faced and furious, her phone clutched like a weapon. She didn't bother with pleasantries this time, just screeched. You destroyed HOA property." I smirked, leaning against the barn. "You mean the illegal surveillance drones? Yeah, they had a little malfunction." Her jaw tightened. "Do you have any idea how much those cost?" I shrugged. "Nope, don't care." And she took a deep breath, visibly trying to rein in her rage. "This isn't over. You'll be hearing from the HOA's legal team." I shot back. "Good luck with that, because last I checked, spying on private property is illegal. But hey, maybe your lawyers will love explaining why you were filming my land without permission." She opened her mouth, then snapped it shut, uncertainty flickering across her face for the first time. I could almost see the gears turning as she tried to plot her next move, but I just smiled, knowing she wasn't done. Karen wasn't the type to give up, and if anything, this was just the opening salvo. Sure enough, as I sat on Earl's porch that evening, sipping a beer and watching the sunset, my phone buzzed. A notification from my outdoor cameras showed more drones, bigger ones, hovering higher than before, their movements smoother, more deliberate. These weren't her cheap toys anymore. Karen had upgraded. Earl chuckled beside me, shaking his head. Figured she would, probably went crying to her HOA board about her precious property and convinced M to double the budget. I stared at the screen, muttering, "She's gonna keep pushing. I need to shut this down before she starts flying those things inside my damn house." And Earl took a long sip of his beer, grinning. "Then it's time to step up our game." The next morning, I set up more jammers around the property. Earl had given me a stronger model, one with a wider radius. And I placed one near the barn, another by the chicken coop, and a third in the middle of the field. If Karen wanted to play, she was about to lose big. The first new drone appeared just after noon, hovering cautiously like it was testing the waters. Then another joined it, and within minutes, 3 more circled like mechanical hawks. I flipped on the jammers, crossed my arms, and waited. The results were instant. One drone wobbled violently, then spun out, crashing into my cornfield. The second jerked left, its camera tilting wildly before smashing into a fence post. The third dropped so fast it looked swatted by an invisible hand. By the time the fourth and fifth went down, I was grinning ear to ear, the wreckage a satisfying mess of twisted metal and shattered pride. Then I heard the shouting. Karen stormed up my driveway, her face redder than a sunburnt tomato, waving her phone like it was a legal summons, her voice shrill with fury. "You absolute menace! You think you can destroy HOA property without consequences?" I leaned against the fence, unimpressed. "Your property was trespassing again," and she stomped her foot. "Those drones are legally authorized surveillance equipment." I raised an eyebrow. "Authorized by who?" "You." "Because last I checked, you don't have jurisdiction over my land." She took a deep breath, trying to regain composure. "This is about community standards, Jake. Your farm is an eyesore. It brings down property values." I laughed. "An eyesore? Lady, this is a farm. Farms have dirt. Farms have equipment. Farms don't follow your suburban princess handbook." Her nostrils flared. "This isn't over." And she marched back to her car, slamming the door so hard the whole thing shook. As she sped off, I knew this wasn't just about property values anymore. It was personal, and I was ready for whatever she threw next. The victory over Karen's upgraded drones felt sweet, but the silence that followed was too eerie, too perfect. Like the calm before a storm you know is coming, and I wasn't about to let my guard down with someone as stubborn as her still out there plotting. That evening, as I checked the jammers still humming quietly around my farm, I noticed something odd. No new drones had appeared all day, which wasn't like Karen. She'd never been one to retreat, so I stepped outside just as the sun dipped below the horizon, and that's when I saw it. A single drone, bigger than any before, hovering at the edge of my property, motionless, almost waiting. I frowned, stepping closer, and caught the logo on its side. Not the HOA's cheap sticker, but a professional-grade mark that made my stomach sink. This wasn't Karen's usual nonsense. She'd escalated, bringing an outside muscle. I bolted inside and called Earl, who answered on the first ring. "I see it," he said before I could speak, his voice low. "What the hell is it?" Earl sighed. "That's a private security drone, man. She must have hired someone." I clenched my jaw. "Can the jammer take it down?" He hesitated. "Maybe, but if she paid for top-tier surveillance, it might have countermeasures. These things are built to resist interference." And I watched it through the window, my mind racing. Karen had officially lost it, turning this from petty HOA games into something far uglier. "Well," I said after a moment, "guess it's time for Plan B." And Earl laughed. "You got a Plan B?" I smirked. "Yeah, and it's gonna be fun." The next day we got to work. Earl called in an old buddy who owed him a favor, a guy who knew how to redirect signals instead of just jamming them, and we rigged up a makeshift signal hijacker, a device designed to take control of the drone rather than knock it out of the sky. By evening, when Karen's new toy reappeared, hovering smugly over my field, we were ready. I flipped the switch, and the drone twitched, wobbled, then suddenly turned. It hovered for a second before taking off, straight toward Karen's house, and Earl whooped. "Hell yeah, look at that sucker go." Through binoculars, I watched it circle her perfectly manicured backyard, dipping low to knock over a decorative lawn gnome, then veering toward her patio, sending a cup flying off her table. Karen burst outside, her face twisted in horror, waving her arms like she was shooing an angry goose, but we weren't done. With a quick tweak, Earl sent it plunging into her swimming pool, the splash glorious as she stood frozen, mouth flapping like a fish out of water, before letting out an ear-piercing scream that had us laughing so hard we could barely breathe. I knew she'd come back swinging. Karen wasn't the type to let humiliation slide. And sure enough, the next morning I woke to sirens blaring. Groaning, I peeked out the window to see two police cruisers in my driveway, Karen standing beside them, arms crossed, her victorious smirk screaming trouble. I stepped outside, wiping my hands on my jeans as Deputy Wilkins approached, a tired look in his eyes. He'd dealt with Karen's nonsense before, so his sigh wasn't surprising. "Morning, Jake," he said. "Karen says you've been destroying her property and engaging in cyber warfare against the HOA. I blinked. "Cyber warfare?" Karen cut in. "Yes. He used some illegal device to hijack my security drone and crash it into my pool. That's destruction of private property, and I demand he be arrested." Wilkins pinched the bridge of his nose as I snorted. "Karen, we've been over this. You were using drones to spy on private property. That's illegal." She gasped like I'd slapped her. "It was for the good of the community. Your farm's an eyesore, and I was collecting evidence of violations." I shot back. "Violations of what?" "Your personal sense of Dacre." Wilkins glanced between us, then sighed again. "Karen, unless you've got actual proof of a crime, there's nothing we can do," and her smug expression faltered. But he... "Nothing he can do," Wilkins repeated, slower. "Stop wasting police resources." She huffed indignantly, stomped to her car, and peeled out so fast she nearly clipped my mailbox. I watched the dust settle as Wilkins shook his head. "You know she ain't gonna let this go, right?" I nodded. "Oh, I know, she's just getting started." That night I spotted something new. Another drone, bigger, flanked by two more, moving in perfect sync. These weren't her usual toys. She'd upgraded again, and I groaned, "Oh, come on." Earl, sipping a beer on my porch, whistled low. "Damn, she went all in this time," and I zoomed in on my phone, muttering, "Looks military grade." This wasn't a game anymore. Karen had turned it into a war, and I wasn't about to lose. The sight of those military-grade drones buzzing over my farm sent a chill down my spine. Karen had gone from petty tyrant to full-on warlord, and I wasn't about to let her turn my land into her personal surveillance playground. Earl lounged on my porch, beer in hand, eyeing the trio of high-tech intruders with a grin that told me he was already scheming. He let out a low whistle. "She's not messing around anymore." And I muttered, "Yeah, well, neither am I," he chuckled. "I got something for that," and disappeared into his workshop, returning with a case he flipped open to reveal a device that looked like a sci-fi rifle, sleek and ominous. "This," he said proudly, "is a high-powered electromagnetic pulse emitter. One squeeze of the trigger and anything electronic in range shuts down." And I grinned, taking it from him. "I like it." He handed it over with a warning, just be careful, it's got a wide radius, so don't aim it at your tractor unless you want to reset the damn thing. And I nodded, stepping outside to face the drones, their synchronized hum a taunt I was ready to silence. I took aim at the lead one, pulled the trigger, and the effect was instant. It sputtered, twitched, then dropped like a rock. The other two spiraled down in a chaotic mess of sparks, one splashing into the creek, the other smashing right into Karen's precious white picket fence. Earl's loud laugh echoed behind me. Oh, she's gonna be livid. I didn't have to wait long to find out. By morning, Karen was back, and this time she'd brought reinforcements, storming up my driveway with an entire HOA crew, including two guys in suits who looked too polished for a drone spat. She marched straight at me, pointing an accusing finger. You've crossed the line this time, Jake. I folded my arms. Oh, and how's that? She gestured dramatically to the broken drone tangled in her fence. These were top-of-the-line surveillance drones, and you illegally interfered with them. I have legal representation now, and I'm filing a lawsuit. One of the suits stepped forward, adjusting his tie. Mr. Jacobson, I'm Richard Calloway, representing the HOA's legal interests. We have reason to believe you've engaged in unlawful activity, including destruction of property and interference with community security measures. I stared at him. Security measures? Those things were spying on me, but he stayed expressionless. The HOA reserves the right to monitor properties to ensure compliance. I smirked. You mean properties within the HOA's jurisdiction, which, in case you forgot, I'm not in. And Calloway hesitated, a crack in his polished facade, while Karen's face twisted in frustration. It doesn't matter. I won't let you make a mockery of this community. I took a step forward, lowering my voice so everyone could hear. Karen, do you know what's illegal? She folded her arms. What? I pointed at the drone wreckage. Unauthorized surveillance, privacy violations, stalking, trespassing, all of which you've been doing for weeks. Her mouth opened, then shut, and Calloway shifted uncomfortably as I grinned. And you know what's funny? I've got all the footage your drones recorded, everything, including where they crashed and how they were on my land without permission. Earl, who'd been quietly filming the whole showdown, held up his phone. Got it all right here. And Karen's face drained of color. She stammered. But I cut her off. So here's what's gonna happen. You're gonna take your fancy lawyer and your little HOA cult and walk away, because if you don't, I'll be the one filing a lawsuit. And trust me, Karen, I'll win. Silence fell, her hands trembling as she clenched her fists. The HOA board members whispered among themselves, and Calloway cleared his throat. I believe it'd be in everyone's best interest to avoid further legal disputes. Karen spun on him, eyes blazing. You work for me. You're supposed to be on my side. He adjusted his tie. I represent the HOA, and frankly, Mrs. Atkinson, this isn't a case we can afford to lose. She looked like she might explode, her composure shattering as she stood there, surrounded by her crumbling posse. Then, without another word, she spun on her heel and stormed off, her entourage trailing awkwardly behind, the suits muttering apologies as they went. Earl let out a low whistle. Well, that was fun. And I chuckled. Yeah, but I doubt she's done for good. Watching her car peel out in a cloud of dust, knowing Karen's pride wouldn't let her slink away quietly. For a few days, it was quiet. No buzzing, no drones, just the usual sounds of my farm humming along. But I kept the jammers on, the EMP emitter close, because with Karen, peace was just a lull before the next crazy scheme. Earl stopped by one evening, beer in hand, and we sat on the porch, eyeing the horizon, half expecting her to roll up with a tank. She'd surprised me before, and I wasn't ruling anything out. The quiet stretched on for nearly a week after Karen's dramatic exit. My farm bathed in an uneasy peace that felt more like a held breath than a victory. I kept the jammers humming and the EMP emitter within reach, knowing her silence was just a regrouping, not a surrender. Earl dropped by every few days, his truck rattling up the driveway with a six-pack and a grin, and we'd sit on the porch, swapping theories about what she'd try next. He figured she'd escalate to something ridiculous like hearing a private investigator, while I half-joked she'd show up with a fleet of attack helicopters. Neither of us put it past her. Then one evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields gold, my phone buzzed with a camera alert. 3 new drones, bigger and stealthier than before, slipped into view, hovering just beyond the jammer's range, their matte black bodies blending into the dusk. I groaned, she's back, and Earl squinted at them, whistling. Those ain't HOA toys, looks like she's got serious cash behind her now. And I nodded, grabbing the EMP emitter. Guess it's time to test this thing's limits. I aimed, fired, and two dropped instantly, crashing into the dirt with satisfying thuds. But the third darted higher, dodging the pulse like it knew what was coming. Karen had learned, and she'd come prepared. The next morning, she didn't show up in person. No screeching, no suits. Just a letter slid under my door, typed in crisp legalese from Calloway's firm, claiming I violated community safety protocols and demanding $10,000 for the destroyed drones, threatening a lawsuit if I didn't comply by week's end. I laughed, tossing it onto the kitchen table. Her evidence was as shaky as her logic, and I had footage of every drone trespassing on my land, a legal ace up my sleeve she couldn't touch. I called Earl over, showing him the letter, and he grinned. She's bluffing, probably thinks she can scare you into paying up, and I agreed. Let her try. I've got enough to bury her in court if she pushes it. But Karen wasn't waiting for lawyers. By noon, my cameras caught a new drone, this one sleek and silent, hovering so high it was barely a speck. The jammers couldn't reach it, and the EMP missed by a hair. She'd gone beyond petty harassment into something obsessive, and I realized this wasn't just about her precious HOA anymore. It was about winning, no matter the cost. Earl scratched his chin. She's got resources now, might have tapped the HOA budget or called in a favor. And I muttered, well, I'm not playing defense forever. We dug into Plan C. Earl's buddy came through again, hooking us up with a signal booster to extend the hijacker's range. And we spent the afternoon rigging it to snatch that high-flying drone right out of the sky. When it showed up again that evening, gleaming against the twilight, I flipped the switch. The drone twitched, then dove, and with a few tweaks we sent it screaming toward Karen's house once more. It buzzed her roof, clipped her chimney, and crashed into her prized rose garden, petals exploding in a pink cloud as she ran out, shrieking like a banshee. Earl doubled over laughing. That's 2 for 2 in her backyard. But I kept my eyes on her, knowing this latest humiliation would only fuel her fire. She stood there, fists clenched, staring back toward my farm, and I could feel the venom in her glare even from half a mile away. The next day, Deputy Wilkins rolled up, his cruiser kicking up dust as he stepped out, looking more exhausted than ever. Karen's filed another complaint, he said. Says you're waging a drone war and vandalizing her property. I smirked. She's the one flying them over my land. Check my cameras. I've got proof she's trespassing. And he sighed. I'll look, but she's got the HOA board riled up. Might actually take this to court. Wilkins left with a copy of my footage, promising to pass it along, but I knew Karen wouldn't stop at legal threats. Sure enough, that night my cameras picked up a swarm. 5 drones, moving in tight formation, too high for the jammers, too fast for the EMP, and I cursed under my breath. She's gone full psycho. Earl, crashing on my couch after a late beer, sat up. She's gotta be bleeding money for this. Where's she getting it? I shrugged. HOA dues, probably. Those suckers'll fund anything if she spins it right. We watched the drones circle, their red lights blinking like angry eyes, and I felt the game shift. Karen wasn't just fighting for control. She was fighting for her ego, and I'd have to outsmart her, not just outgun her. Tomorrow, I told Earl, we go bigger, shut this down for good, and he grinned. I've got just the thing. The swarm of drones hovering over my farm that night was a declaration of war. 5 sleek machines, their red lights pulsing like a predator's eyes, too high for my jammers and too quick for the EMP. A clear sign Karen had sunk serious cash into her vendetta, probably draining the HOA's coffers to fuel her obsession. Earl sprawled on my couch, rubbing sleep from his eyes as he peered out the window, muttering, She's gotta be bleeding money. Where's she getting it? I shrugged. HOA dues, I bet. Those suckers'll fund anything if she spins it as community safety. We watched them circle, their synchronized dance taunting me, and I knew outgunning her wasn't enough anymore. I had to outsmart her, end this once and for all. Tomorrow, I told Earl, we go bigger, shut her down for good, and he grinned. I've got just the thing, his voice dripping with the kind of mischief that kept him busy in his Air Force days. By morning, he was back with a heavy-duty case, flipping it open to reveal a beast of a device. A long-range signal interceptor he'd borrowed from a friend, capable of not just hijacking drones, but frying their systems permanently. One shot, he said, and they're toast, motherboards cooked, no recovery, and I nodded. Let's roast M. We set it up in the field, calibrating the range to catch anything above my property line, and waited. Sure enough, just past noon, the swarm returned, 5 drones gliding in tight formation, their hum a smug challenge I was itching to crush. I flipped the switch, and the interceptor hummed to life, a low whine building as it locked onto their signals. One by one, they jerked, smoked, then plummeted, crashing into the dirt with a chorus of crunching metal. 2 hit the creek, sending up plumes of water, while another smashed through my old scarecrow, straw flying like confetti. Earl whooped, "That's a turkey shoot!" And I grinned, counting the wreckage, knowing Karen's wallet was feeling every dent. She didn't disappoint. Within an hour, she roared up my driveway in her SUV, leaping out with a fury that turned her face betread, screaming, "You've gone too far, Jake. Those were state-of-the-art drones, $20,000 apiece." I leaned against the porch railing. "Maybe you should have kept M off my land." And she jabbed a finger at me. "I'm suing you for everything you've got. The HOA board's behind me now." I laughed. "Good luck proving that when I've got video of them trespassing. Your security measures are my evidence." She stormed off, tires squealing, and I figured she'd lawyer up again. But the next day brought a twist I hadn't seen coming. A cease and desist letter from Callaway claiming I violated electronic interference laws and demanding I surrender my illegal devices or face criminal charges. Earl read it over my shoulder, chuckling. "She's grasping at straws. This won't hold up. She's got no jurisdiction, and you're defending your property." I nodded, "Yeah, but she's got the board spooked. They might actually push this." And sure enough, that evening my cameras caught a new drone, solo this time, hovering just outside my range, taunting me like Karen was daring me to strike. Earl squinted at it. "She's testing you, probably recording, hoping you'll fry it so she can cry vandalism to the cops." And I cursed. "She's playing dirty now." We held off, letting it buzz away, and I spent the night digging into local laws. Turns out, she'd overstepped big time. Drones over private property without consent violated state privacy statutes, and I had a mountain of footage to prove it. Karen's community standards excuse wouldn't fly in court, and I smirked, realizing I flipped the script. The next morning, I called Deputy Wilkins myself, inviting him over with a stack of evidence. Videos, timestamps, even the HOA's own letters demanding compliance from a non-member. He watched the footage, shaking his head. "She's been flying these over your land for weeks." I nodded. "Yep, and crashing M when I fight back. She's claiming I'm the criminal here." Wilkins sighed. "This is a mess, Jake, but you're in the clear. Her drones are the problem, not your defenses. I'll file a report, maybe get her to back off." He left with the evidence, promising to talk sense into her, but I wasn't holding my breath. Karen's ego was a runaway train, and no deputy was stopping it. That afternoon, Earl and I sat on the porch, sipping beers, when my phone buzzed. A neighbor texted, "HOA meeting tonight, Karen's losing it, board's questioning her spending." And I grinned. She's cracking, feeling the tide turn, but knowing she'd lash out one last time before it broke. The news of Karen's unraveling at the HOA meeting spread like wildfire through the neighborhood grapevine, and I could almost picture her red-faced and flailing as the board grilled her over the thousands she'd funneled into her drone obsession. Earl and I sat on my porch that evening, beers in hand, savoring the thought of her squirming under questions she couldn't dodge. My neighbor's text had been short but juicy. "She's blaming you for everything, says the drones were essential security. But they're onto her spending now, might be the end of her reign," and I grinned. "She's dug her own grave, let's see how deep she goes." I'd handed Wilkins enough evidence to sink her. Weeks of footage showing her drones buzzing my farm, crashing on my land, all time-stamped and undeniable. State law was clear. Unauthorized surveillance over private property was a violation, and her community standards excuse was crumbling faster than her precious picket fence. But Karen wasn't one to go quietly, and I knew she'd try one last desperate swing before the HOA pulled the plug. I kept the interceptor primed, the jammers humming, ready for whatever she threw next. Sure enough, just past dawn, my cameras pinged. A single drone, sleek and silent, slipped into view, hovering low and slow, hugging the edge of my property like it was daring me to react. Earl, crashing on my couch again, stumbled out, squinting. "She's back. Looks like a decoy, testing us." I nodded. "She wants me to fry it, give her something to cry about to the cops." But I held off, letting it buzz harmlessly. Wilkins had my back now, and I wasn't handing her any ammo. By noon, a new letter arrived, this one hand-delivered by a nervous HOA lackey. Karen demanded a formal apology and $50,000 for damages, claiming my reckless interference had cost the community its safety infrastructure. I laughed so hard I nearly choked, tossing it to Earl, who read it aloud in a mocking falsetto. "She's lost it, man, $50,000 for her spy toys." I smirked. "She's delusional, but she's cornered. This is her last gasp." That afternoon, Wilkins called, voice-weary. "Filed the report, Jake. Her drones are illegal, no question. HOA's getting heat from residents, too. She might be out soon." And I thanked him, feeling the noose tighten around her reign of terror. Then, just as the sun dipped low, the real attack came. 3 drones, massive and bristling with tech, roared over my field, diving low enough to rattle the barn windows. Earl bolted upright. "Holy hell, she's gone nuclear!" I grabbed the interceptor, heart pounding. This wasn't a test. It was her final stand, and fired, the pulse ripping through the air. 2 dropped instantly, smashing into the dirt with a crunch that shook the ground, but the third veered sharp, climbing fast. I adjusted, fired again, and it smoked, spiraled, then crashed right into Karen's SUV, parked a half-mile away, the explosion of glass and metal echoing across the fields. Earl whooped, "Direct hit." And I grinned, but the victory was short-lived. Sirens wailed minutes later, and Wilkins rolled up, Karen in tow, her face a mask of triumphant rage as she pointed at the wreckage. "Arrest him. He destroyed my car." Wilkins sighed. "Karen, we've been over this. Your drones were on his land again. I've got the report, and you're the one breaking laws." She screeched, "This is my community. He's a menace." But Wilkins held up a hand. "Enough. HOA's already called an emergency meeting tonight. They're voting on your presidency." She froze, the fight draining from her as the reality hit. The board, fed up with her spending and legal mess, was turning on her. Wilkins escorted her off, muttering, "Stay out of trouble, Jake." And I nodded, watching her SUV limp away, drone wreckage still smoking in its grill. That night, Earl and I cracked open fresh beers, the quiet settling over the farm like a hard-won prize. My phone buzzed with another text. "Karen's out, voted unanimously. She's selling her house." And I laughed. "She's done." The drones were gone, the buzzing silenced, and my farm stood untouched, a testament to outlasting her insanity. Karen had wanted a war, but I'd played smarter, not just harder, and now she was the one running. Earl raised his bottle to victory, and I clinked mine against it, to peace, finally. The dust settled over my farm in the days after Karen's ousting, a stillness I hadn't felt since that first drone buzzed into my life. Earl and I dismantled the jammers and stowed the interceptor, their hum replaced by the rustle of crops and the cluck of chickens, a peace that felt like a trophy after months of aerial warfare. The HOA meeting had been a bloodbath, or so the rumors said. Residents, fed up with Karen's drone fiasco and the thousands she'd siphoned from their dues, voted her out unanimously, her reign crumbling under the weight of her own obsession. By week's end, a "for sale" sign sprouted in her manicured yard, her defeat as public as her smugness had once been. I'd won not just by knocking her toys from the sky, but by letting her overreach until she tripped over her own rules. My footage, handed to Wilkins, had sealed it, proving her drones were the real trespassers and the law had done the rest. Earl stopped by that weekend, grinning over a beer. "She's gone, man. Heard she's moving to some condo downtown, probably plotting revenge on her new neighbors." And I chuckled. "Good riddance. Let her terrorize someone else." Then came the twist I couldn't resist. Karen's house hit the auction block, a steal after her legal bills piled up, and I swooped in, bidding just enough to snag it. Earl raised an eyebrow when I told him, "You're nuts, why buy her place?" I smirked, payback and a little profit, and we got to work gutting her pristine suburban shrine to turn it into something practical. A farm supply store, stocked with feed, tools, and seeds, the kind of stuff her aesthetic standards despised. We hung a sign out front, "Karen's Exile Feed and Supply," the letters bold and unmissable, and I couldn't help but smile every time I walked past it. Her legacy flipped into mine, a daily reminder that she'd lost, and I'd gotten the last laugh. The grand opening drew a crowd. Neighbors who'd cheered her downfall stopped by, some shaking my hand, others snapping pics of the sign, and one old-timer muttered, "Best thing to happen to this street since she moved in," while buying a sack of grain. Even Wilkins swung by off-duty, chuckling, "You're a piece of work, Jake. This'll haunt her forever." The store thrived, a quiet jab at Karen's memory, but the real win was the farm. Free of her buzzing tyranny, it felt like mine again, the fields stretching out undisturbed, the barn no longer a target for her petty crusades. Earl and I kept the interceptor as a souvenir, mounted on my wall like a hunter's trophy, and he'd tease, "Ready for round 2 if she ever comes back," though we both knew she wouldn't. Word was, her lawsuits had fizzled, her lawyers ditching her when the HOA cut funding, and she'd slunk off to lick her wounds, her real estate empire a pile of rubble. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, my phone buzzed, a grainy photo from a neighbor, Corinne's old SUV parked downtown, sporting a bumper sticker that read, "I heart rules," and I laughed. She's still Corinne, just someone else's problem now. Earl clinked his bottle against mine, to winning the war, and I nodded, to keeping the peace. Looking back, it wasn't just about the drones. It was about standing up to someone who thought power came from control, not consent. Corinne had misjudged me, thinking I'd bend to her whims, but I'd outlasted her, turning her weapons into my victory lap. The farm supply store was more than a business. It was proof that her community standards couldn't choke out what mattered: hard work, good neighbors, and a little ingenuity when the odds stacked up. Michael's words from that other story echoed in my head: "We don't choose our challenges, but we choose how they change us." And Corinne's madness had changed me, sharpened my resolve, made me appreciate the quiet I'd fought for. Every sale at Corinne's exile was a small triumph, every handshake a nod to the fight we'd won. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the fields gold, I knew this was my land, my win, my laugh. Hers was just the echo that faded away.